Welcome to Season to Taste. This is Crispy Clip by Yum Audio. So what does it do? It's a clipper. So I'm going to solo out this like little bassy arp here. Okay, and at the moment Crispy Clip is off, so it's not doing anything. So we're going to turn it on and then we'll have a look. And let's hear it in the mix a bit more. So this is Yum Audio. At the moment, I have the drums soloed down here. I guess you like that effect. And we're going to just play the drums, and then we're going to use everything in Yum Audio. So I'm going to go through the interface really briefly. We have the ceiling here. So this is how high we have the clips hitting. Then we also have push. So this is how much input gain we're putting in to push into the clipper. I quite like the verbiage here because then it makes it a bit easier for you to understand if you've never really used a clipper before. A lot of clippers do use this, but I still quite like its interface. In the middle here, you have either an analog or a digital looking interface to show you what your sort of like current measurements are for your clipping. In the middle here, this is a little waveform indicator. So this will show you visually, like when I bring the ceiling down, where it is that your waves are hitting before the clipper and then after the clipper, what they look like in case you want to see it visually. I'm going to show you this crossover thing later. We have mix over here. I'm going to leave this at 100 and we're going to play and just see what we can get out of it. Yes, that sounds very good. Of course, maybe you wouldn't use this on a drum bus. You might use this in like individual hits in your drums, but I thought I'd use it here just to show exactly what it does. Also, it's a relatively simple drum beat. If I go back to the first version of this drum beat, so the main bit, this is what we have instead. And in fact, that drum beat is quite a good use of this crossover function. So what the crossover does is it lets you set where the clipping happens. So you can either have it happening everywhere, or like I had in my bass, you can have it just in the like treble region. So you can use this as a high pass filter so that you only have it affecting the high stuff. So you can hear that the kick drum is kind of being left alone and it's only really affecting the snare and the hats. Or alternatively, low. And I'm going to have to turn that down and we're going to turn this up. So then that way we're only affecting things like the kick drum. I think that would be really good if you're using this on a loop that is audio and you wanted to have things split out, because then that way you can still affect individual things in that loop, especially if it's something like a drum kit loop. You can still affect like some of the instruments in that drum kit a bit more separately. Also, it's great to add specific texture. So I sometimes use something called Saturn 2, which is by FabFilter, for my distortion. I can use this to just get clipping in that similar sort of way, in a multi-band sort of way, or at least in a single band. You could, if you want to, have a few of these running concurrently and then have different amounts of clipping for each bit, which I haven't tried yet, but would be quite good. Of course, we want to hear it inside the mix, so let's play everything. And we'll unsolo the drums once I've set everything back to where it should be. And we'll have a bit of a play and we'll see what we can get out of it. And that's Crispy Clip. In fact, I quite like Crispy Clip enough. Yep, favorites. There you go. Yay! So Crispy Clip is one of those plugins that I like because, much like Devil Lock Deluxe, another one of my favorites, it's really simple but gives you great results. And in fact, it goes a little bit further than being really simple by giving you control exactly where you need it. It comes at £79 here in the UK at full price. I think a lot of that comes down genuinely to the way that they oversample, because otherwise I would kind of think that that would be a bit expensive. I think it's still a little bit expensive, but if you could get the use out of it, and if it basically goes into every track that you make, then I think eventually it will kind of pay for itself. As standard, I'm more than happy to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the description down below. I tend to read all of them, but yeah, enjoy the rest of your day. Cool.